reinforcing that nature and connection to nature is important to me. I was a researcher during college, as I mentioned. I worked briefly for Planned Parenthood. This feels like a little bit of a divergence for me because I was in all these ecology jobs. I was trying to take all these women's studies classes, but what I loved about that was it was the first place where science really mattered. And granted, it was health science, but it also pulled in that activism and that feminist perspective in a way that felt more holistic in terms of how our communities can be more resilient. I did Peace Corps in Fiji, which I know is a bummer, but I was an environmental resource. I'm kidding about it being a bummer. If you know, usually when I'm in a room of people and not on a Zoom call doing like presentations, this is like everyone kind of groans when I say Fiji. But I was in Peace Corps. I did environmental work there, working with rural villages, working with the Fiji women's rights movement, but still kind of doing both of those things in different buckets of my life, right? I include bartending on here, even though I don't include that on my like professional resume, but it's one of the best ways I have learned to communicate with people. My tips depended on it. I communicated with all people from all different walks of life, and also learned how to make mediocre drinks. I'm much better at making drinks now. All right, then I taught high school science. So I taught high school science for a couple of years at a performing arts high school in Florida before coming to grad school. And I was also the planning and sustainable design dual degree chase. So that was a fun journey that feels a little bit like a ping pong. But all of that really informs kind of what core values I hold dear that really inform the kind of work I do. So I'm a principal at Asakura Robinson. I already talked about them. I vice chair the Environmental Commission and the Joint Sustainability Committee for the City of Austin. I serve as board member on the Trail Foundation, and I actually need to update this also with Austin Outside, which is a coalition of outdoor environmental parks, trails, etc. organizations. I used to be a board member with Equality Texas, and I include that because I still do a ton of LGBTQ advocacy that I think is directly relevant to climate justice and environmental justice and queer justice and trans justice and all of that. And then I'm also teaching starting this fall. So that's me in a nutshell. And I think for each individual person, it's so important to challenge some of the silos you were taught in school to be able to do really great resilience work. It's also important to be able to work across different disciplines with folks in a team. So I think a lot about how we can pull scientists into design and planning. And so this is an image of Catherine Hayhoe, who's at Texas Tech. She is a world-renowned climate scientist. But you know, there's some limitations to the way these academic disciplines, so science or planning or design or policy making or engineering, are all taught to think about change within the systems. And really, resilience is all about adapting to change in a way that is for the greater good and equitably for the greater good. So scientists, though, they have a really hard time doing things that are outside of just studying change. So when you ask a scientist to say, all right, but how should we manipulate a system to change it for the better, it's a little bit out of their academic silo. Then we have like planning and policy folks. So a little more kind of my graduate level wheelhouse. This is Colleen McHugh. She's at the Water Institute of the Gulf, has worked on Resilient New Orleans, worked on Resilient Houston with her. These kind of folks are mostly creating those frameworks for how you can manage change. So hopefully that's being informed by all the science. And then hopefully that's informing the way change is implemented on the ground. So engineering and design that really looks at, you know, how does the policy framework inform what I can do on the ground and what I can't? And what does the science say about how to do it the best way possible if you're a good designer? So hopefully all these folks are talking together. That does not always happen. All right. One of the other barriers besides all these silos in terms of doing resilience work is language. And I love this picture. There's this blog. If y'all haven't heard of it, y'all have to follow it. It's called The Nature of Cities. And it is international. It is very intentionally international. I've been on conference calls with folks in India and London and South America and all over the US all at once, planning for this summit that we went to in Paris in 2019. And one of the coolest things about this was a session we went to that talked all about urban nature, that you know, everyone for the most part spoke English in the room, but one of the other ways we tried to overcome some of the language barriers that might exist for a truly international conference was they brought two illustrators in to illustrate the conversations that were happening. So this is them kind of talking through some of the illustrations that came out from breakout groups. So how do we define resilience? This is also something that is a little complex in terms of a language barrier. And this is even just in English, a language barrier. But if you are more on the environmental science side or the climate science side, you might define resilience a little bit more narrowly than what many folks are really thinking of as resilience these days. So this is the Google definition. Google says it's the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties or toughness. Sorry, I'm just pulling your chats over so I can see it. So that doesn't quite get it for me, this definition of resilience, and it's not really applying to certain systems. All right, so then if we add in adaptation, this is certainly a part of how I define resilience. So this is the idea that we're building back better. We're not just recovering, right? So that's part of the way I define resilience. Most people are defining resilience these days as the ability to survive, adapt, and thrive in the face of major shocks, things like COVID, things like Hurricane Harvey in Houston, things like Katrina, things like major droughts, things like a terrorist attack even. So major shocks like that and chronic stressors. So how do you include in your resilience strategy thinking around chronic homelessness and poverty, or chronic health issues, or nuisance flooding even, or other differential access to parks, all of those kind of chronic issues. All right, so one of the ways that again, we try to overcome some of those communication barriers, even just the way we define things, is by creating graphics. Graphics are so useful. And I think, you know, for folks who aren't coming from design professions, I think sometimes they can be a little underrated. So this is one that we created for a resilience focused parks plan that we worked on in Houston. And what this is trying to communicate is that you're on this traditional trajectory. If you have an impact, one of those shock events, you can rebuild to the baseline, which is basically what that Google definition of resilience is, or you can build to this adaptive trajectory. Excuse me. Sorry, my dog is like trying to get in under my feet right now. So you can build to this adaptive trajectory, and that's, again, how I define resilience, not how everyone defines resilience. So making sure that we're adding adaptation as a key part of our definition was part of this. The other thing is, again, it's not just environmental resilience. So we've found that it's important to bring other ways of thinking and bodies of knowledge and other systems into things. So we've increasingly done more work in like the public health sector. And there's this entire concept called One Health that really ties together ecological health and public health as just things that are directly tied to one another and that have to go hand in hand. So this is a toolkit that we created for the Episcopal Health Foundation that looked at providing low barrier to entry ideas for clinics to actually get involved in basically the built environment in their community. So how can you improve the food systems in your community or provide more food access, either through policies, programs, even built work? We looked at how can you help your community to have safer homes that are good for the health of the people who live there, better connection to nature, improved air and soil quality, water quality. How can you mitigate urban heat island? And really what I love about this too was, again, it was geared toward folks who are working at a clinic who want to be able to start working upstream of some of the things that they're seeing at the clinic. And then this doesn't just include this planning and kind of high level design scale. This also includes built work. So this is an urban prairie project that our firm worked on at MD Anderson, which is a hospital in Houston. And we worked directly with a lot of ecological and urban prairie advocates in Houston. This is ongoing monitoring happening on this site. But what we love also, we're increasingly working with hospital and medical kind of campus partners to really look at how these spaces even improve things like recovery time of patients after a surgery or after a major illness. So we just did also a green roof for Methodist Hospital in Houston, and they're actually running a study at that hospital that looks at whether or not there's reductions in the amount of pain relievers used for folks who are going through the same surgeries or same treatments, who have more access to the roof or more time spent on the roof. So they're actually studying the impact on use of medicine related to the ability to connect with these green spaces. All right. Next one, do you want me to stop at all? You want me to chat? Nathan says you love the illustration. Thanks. You feel free to chat in the main thing. Any questions so far? All right, I'll keep going. All right, so I have this ecological background. That's where I went for undergrad, was more in the ecological sciences. And so this idea of systems thinking is something that always resonates with me. It's this thing where, planners are usually or often pretty good at this as well, really understanding the connections between all the different systems in a city or in a place, and also trying to understand all those different scales where things are happening. So, one of the framings that we use often for thinking about the benefits of multifunctional design at all different scales is ecosystem services. Are y'all familiar with ecosystem services?
Yes.
I'm nodding.
Yes.
Yeah. So this is one of the ideas for framing that honestly is really, to me, based in this idea of systems thinking. It's a little bit more centered on the environmental systems, but you're looking at aesthetics, you're looking at education, you're looking at the provision of basic needs here. You're looking at there's equity and justice built into this when you look at it in place. And so this is one of the kind of foundational frameworks in ecology and environmental science for really being a systems thinker. And then across scales, just going back to my example of scientists, designers, engineers, planners, policymakers, this is also one of those mismatches. It's not just the language, it's not just the silos you're taught in your academic practice, but sorry, I'm just looking at your chat. But it's also scale that's part of our disconnect across disciplines. And so often scientists could be studying everything from like the biodiversity under a log all the way up to Catherine Hayhoe, who is literally looking at global climate change. Whereas so often designers are really, there are many first-year architecture students, or maybe not even first year, maybe I'm giving them too much credit, who design a building in a void. And what is a building designed without context of space and the larger ecosystem it's with? And so planning and policymakers often have a hard time thinking about design scales. So you might have a land use map that shows that, okay, that's park space, that's vacant land, that's single family, but there's so much nuance, even in just, there's a bunch of research that's coming out of the Midwest around population dynamics of coyotes and other small carnivorous mammals that inhabit urban spaces, and looking at their ranges is really interesting when you look across different development patterns in different cities, and thinking about the kinds of spaces in a park that might actually be refuge in an urban place for those species completely depends on the way that park is designed and the way that park is meant to function in terms of how people and wildlife use it. So planning and policy often isn't nuanced enough to really get at the scale that is the most relevant anyway to kind of ecological and resilience thinking. So I wanted to give some examples of different scales of green infrastructure, just because often we're talking about green infrastructure a lot. Like it's something somewhat of a buzzword. Often in Texas, we're talking about green infrastructure like as green stormwater infrastructure. We care most about the water benefits of it and not as much about like some of the other benefits of green infrastructure. But part of the other issue about the way we talk about green infrastructure is a lot of times people are thinking about a single site, a single rain garden, a single detention basin, a single feature, right? And we do not have a plan in Austin, Texas for green infrastructure that's citywide. And we're starting to talk about it, and we're starting to do some initial phase work on that at the city. But again, we're missing opportunities to really maximize the benefits of a green infrastructure network if we're still doing piecemeal projects without that larger plan. So Bagby Street in Houston's a project that's won a bunch of awards. It's 0.62 miles. We have the AMD site here in Austin and West Austin that's 59 acres, single owner, had won some awards in the past for its green infrastructure design. But that's nothing even just compared to the Waller Creek watershed. If you go a little bit higher, South Central Waterfront and Mueller Development both have green infrastructure that's designed into the way South Central will develop ideally, and the way Mueller was developed. But those are still only 100. For the site and to help drive really we ended up facilitating all of the sustainability conversations with city departments, the design team, and sometimes members of the community as well. So everything from electric vehicle charging to dark skies compliance to some of the green infrastructure features on site and beyond. But one of the things we did at the very beginning was really make sure we understood the context of the site in the larger system. So it's literally the headwaters of Little Walnut Creek, which flows into Walnut Creek and eventually out to the Colorado River. So important context there. We look at iNaturalist data to try to understand where people are interacting with wildlife. And I feel like that's an important point to make. Are y'all familiar with iNaturalist?
Yes.
Oh, Nathan is not. Okay. It's cool. My wife is not like an environment nerd. She's like our household sustainability nerd, but she's not like the nature nerd. She loves it. And it's this app you can download and you can take observations. You take images from around your neighborhood or really literally anywhere you go. They're geo-referenced, so they're tagged to a location on a map, and it'll help you try to figure out what you've seen, and you can log it. And then scientists can come on and say, oh yeah, you're right, that is what that is, or no, you're wrong, try this. And it has to be verified by multiple scientists, and then it can be a research grade observation. So it's also open source to download. So we download that, and Christina says she relies on iNaturalist. I think it's just so cool. And just added a bird call on it. Oh, that's cool. I didn't know that, Andrew. So anyway, what I try to make sure I am clear about is that iNaturalist is not scientifically rigorous in terms of being able to say, here's where the wildlife is. What it's really saying is, here's where the people are seeing the wildlife. So really it's a metric of people-nature connection. And why I think this is so important for us to use in urban places is because it shows us that even in places that are as industrial as some of the areas near JJ Pickle and McCalla where the stadium is, people are still observing wildlife. And you can also see a little bit more of a skew toward observations that are nearer to the canopy that we're showing. So we're showing tree canopy in green on here. And significantly more if we zoom out a little bit further and show some of the larger green spaces that are just maybe one step out. We also look historically, so this is an image of 1964 aerial of the site where the stadium is, which what I love about this is the low point here where the pond is actually where the bioinfiltration basin and the major green infrastructure feature on the site of the stadium is. So they use the natural topography of the stadium to really improve the water quality for that entire watershed, because not only is the site treating water that is coming off the site, but they're also treating a number of non-compliant properties that were developed prior to that ordinance being in place that are immediately adjacent to the property, because they sized up that infrastructure and paid for the diversion of water from those off-site properties. All right, Resilient Houston. This is just one example of one of the places where we've, again, thought across scales. And I love it because it very much encapsulates everything I'm talking about tonight. So we were one of the sub-consultants on this project, but the entire thing is set up across scales. Chapter 1 is about prepared and thriving Houstonians, so that individual and family scale. The next one is neighborhood. Then they talk about bayous as that kind of connective tissue across the city. Then there's the citywide and the region. So every chapter kind of steps through those scales and talks about resilience really holistically. Just one other example, we're doing some urban greening work in Galveston, where we're looking at the island as a whole, and we use transects a lot to kind of think through the way different systems are interacting across a space. And so we're looking at everything from development patterns to heat to where tourism value is highest, where there might be more exposure to pollution, at the aerial imagery of these sites and beyond. And this was a part of framing up some work we did to develop some guiding principles for the way Galveston can green up all of their urban spaces over the years, not just parks, but we also have designed some pilot concepts for Jones Park and Shield Park that you see called out here that are really underutilized, horrible examples of what a park could be. But that demonstrate at a site scale kind of those system scale recommendations that we've made for the island as a whole. All right, how am I doing? All right, so third one, we talk a lot about being an equity driven practice, and I think this is more important than ever. And you know, this is another space where I think it's inexcusable for anyone in the environmental and conservation field to not be doing the work on equity and justice to really incorporate that into practice. And just some examples, I didn't include it here, but we just are wrapping up some work for Great Springs Project on an equity framework that will guide their future work in developing that greenway system. Thanks, Angela. That will guide that greenway system development between the Alamo and Barton Springs. So they're trying to connect a greenway system where you could literally connect to all 4 major springs in the hill country. But just some other examples of how we're trying to connect community voice in a way that gives more agency in process. So we just did a health-focused parks plan in Pasadena, which is just east of Houston. It's very industrial. There's a large Latinx population there. And it's got really interesting dynamics. So it touches the bay. So there's sea level rise issues. There's major flooding issues along these bayous. There's huge industrial areas that have had major industrial accidents and air quality issues to the north. There's also Armand Bayou Nature Center, which you see a little bit cut off at the bottom, which is one of the coolest places to engage with nature in the Houston region. And then you also have some really vulnerable communities of people and ecosystems. So it's a really interesting place to do health-focused, environmental, and equity-focused work. And one of the things that we did at the city scale was we basically looked at over 60 variables that looked at environmental vulnerability and risk. So again, flooding, sea level rise, urban heat, things like that. Second index was we looked at community health disparities. So Where are the areas in town that have the most disparate health problems, the most chronic health problems? So everything from obesity and diabetes to mental health issues to asthma and respiratory illness, et cetera. Third index that we looked at was socioeconomic vulnerability. So that's things like people living below the poverty line, English as a second language, only high school education, no vehicle, and also looking at seniors, also looking at race, also looking at households with children, all of those different socioeconomic vulnerability things. And then the fourth index was looking at park access. So who actually has access to a park within a 5 to 10 minute walk? And then we combined all those indices, and we also asked the community and the key stakeholder committee of those variables and of those 4 indices, which are the highest priority to you in Pasadena? And we weighted those different variables and indices specific to the context of what was important in this community. And this map in the background is what came out of that. So all of the red areas are the most vulnerable areas when you combine all those factors together holistically. And so that helps us to make sure that we're targeting parks investments in a way that responds to those unique variables, but also occur in the places that have the potential to have the highest impact for people and ecosystems. And then we also tied that to design standards. So this is just one card from our design standards chapter that looked at what the health benefits of water recreation could be, what scales this would be appropriate at, how it's tied to community feedback. So that's the what we heard section, and then place-based considerations. So if you look at the GIS data and you see that there's higher obesity or higher blood pressure, this is probably something that is worth implementing in that area. All right, I'm going to skip this one. All right. So 4 is really just recognizing the difference between values and goals. So you guys, it sounds like some of you have come from this science background and a variety of other backgrounds, but I think scientists tend to be very principled about their values. And I will make this generalization that often that translates to scientists being a little too principled about getting other people to align with their goals. So I'll give you an example, and I'll pick on watershed protection a little bit, even though I work with them all the time and I love them. They, have direction from city council here in the city to basically focus on these 3 issues: erosion, water quality, and water quantity. How can they mitigate flooding? How can they improve the health, the ecological health of our streams? How can they reduce erosion? How can they, so these things, and if it's very directly related to these things, that's totally their wheelhouse. But when you start talking about things that might get people to understand these things a little bit better, but that are a little more tangentially related, scientists have a hard time understanding the connection. So I had a conversation with someone who's like, we just need to get people to implement more green infrastructure projects. And I said, okay, well, how do you think you want to go about doing that? And the response was, well, they just need to be educated about the water quality benefits of doing this. We've done all the modeling. We have these huge watershed scale benefits from like just a X% implementation of these green infrastructure features, but people are just ignorant, basically. They just need to understand the benefits and then they'll act. And that's just not the case. And so I said, well, what if they care more about water savings on watering their garden if they install a cistern? Or what if they care more about pollinators? Or what if they care more about energy efficiency savings if you design their landscape in a way that helps mitigate some of the heat that their home is dealing with in the summer? Or what if they care more about aesthetics? They want a yard to look awesome. And so I think this is really a place that we fail a lot. So there's these 3 categories I like to think through. One is where values and goals align. This is where someone cares about the water quality benefits and they act. That's where the values and goals align for someone in watershed trying to get them to act on installing a rain garden. Values misalign, goals align. Maybe they care about pollinators and you care about water quality, but you both can arrive at the same goal. Number 3 is a tougher one that I'm not even going to touch on right now. But I just think we can't lose sight of these places where we might have a mismatch in values, but that our goals align. And Sydney, you have a question. Yeah, so metrics on projects. So is there a specific, so like on Pasadena. So metrics are so important, and we're increasingly trying to team with academic partners, especially on certain projects. So I think, for instance, the Resilient Houston, for instance, and the Houston Climate Action Plan are 2 plans that Rice University's Kinder Institute has decided they're going to track the implementation of through a transparent, online, publicly accessible dashboard. And they have found funding to do this, but that is often not something that the public entity tracks in a way that is very rigorous. And I'll give you an example in a second. And it's really difficult for consultants to make a case for that ongoing tracking. And so it really depends on the project. We constantly try to get clients to integrate that thinking into their work. And so we do a lot of neighborhood scale planning, and there's this agency in Houston that we help to come up with an entire implementation and tracking system for projects coming out of that program. It's called the Livable Centers Program. And then they release report cards every couple of years on their plans to say, here's where we're tracking on implementation, and here's the impact. But it is so hit or miss with certain projects. And often you really need that academic partner to step in. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about stacking benefits. This is kind of directly tied to that values and goals thing. So often, like when you're talking about a single site, you have certain folks who get there and say, I want it to be this thing specifically, and someone else who says something different. And I think we often miss opportunities, especially for public parks and public lands, to do many different things. So this is a little graphic we did for Dallas Water Gardens in Houston, where the core reason we were being brought in was because, well, just to back up, Dallas Water Gardens is immediately southeast of downtown Houston, but it is historic meanders of the Trinity River that were cut off from the Trinity River by the levee system when it was constructed. So they look like horrible detention ponds. And so we were brought in to help inform the way they could be more thoughtful as they were updating their flood control system and pump system as a part of that. And so we were tasked with kind of integrating this more multifunctional thinking. So these are the guiding principles we developed. So improving water quality and mitigating urban environmental impacts like flooding. Those are the 2 key things that like everyone was like, the engineers were like, yes, that's what we're doing here. The other things, creating habitat, that was a key piece of this. They wanted this to be an urban ecological destination. Boosting the local economy. How does this influence the economic development of parcels nearby and the quality of life for people? The visual interest of the site, the connection to the river, and then also this idea that this could be a space that's focused on health and opportunities for active recreation and wellness. So we also created this graphic for that Houston resilience focused parks plan that really looked at, again, all those different things that you can do if you design a park site really well. Everything from urban habitat to green infrastructure and heat island mitigation to thinking about improved air quality and active living opportunities. Clark, you have a comment. It's true. If you know what I know, you would agree with me. Yeah. I'm going to have to save you the way you said that. All right. Another example of a place we're trying to think more expansively about the role of certain kinds of work is in our trail design work. So often trail design is about how many more miles can I add? How wide does it have to be able to compete with all these different mobility uses for bikers, for runners, for a mom with a stroller? What are the kind of furnishings at trailheads? So we did some of that. We did these really cool custom shade structures, and we did different custom ones for different places, different sections along the trail, all influenced by different cultural or ecological identities of those different places along the trail. But we also thought about shade provision along the trail. It's like one of the number one things people ask for in parks and trails is more trees. So we talked about trail appropriate trees and which would have the most shade provision because of their potential canopy size. We provided this tree list. And we also talked about the ways green infrastructure should just be a standard part of the way you develop trails and trailheads. I want to mention functional green. This is something that has been proposed in Austin that was worked on by a handful of folks through the city of Austin in their public works department. And not something that we worked on, but I mentioned it nonetheless because I'm super impressed with it. It's something that if we ever pass a land development code would be embedded in it. And I think, Angela, you were a part of conversations, I think, about some of this at some point too, but it's this ecosystem services based calculation for developers who are developing in the most urban, most densely developed places in Austin to be able to integrate ecological value into their spaces. So basically stacking all these landscape features, green roofs, cisterns, all of these features to get a minimum score, that would be, that will allow them to get their permitting. And that minimum score is based on developers that are already developing in that way, just driven by the market, as kind of the minimum score that we would start with. So we were able to make a market case for this, in addition to really rethinking the way even our most dense urban developments can green up. Clark says, do you set up metrics to evaluate the impact of green infrastructure on health of the greater than human community flora and fauna that lived and have lived in a specific area? So again, it depends on the project. So that initial project, I call Urban Prairie green infrastructure. So that MD Anderson project, that's Urban Prairie, had some ongoing wildlife monitoring. And some projects have that. Not all do. Bagby Street in Houston is something that we had a small sub-consultant role. So that's one of the ones I showed in my scales of green infrastructure. And that one specifically went through this program called the Landscape Performance Series that was through, I believe, the American Society of Landscape Architects, where they tracked performance years after it was constructed. So again, it's kind of a one-off. Let's see. And Andrew, you say it reminds you of LEED. There's actually a LEED for landscapes. It's called Sites. It's called Sustainable Sites, and it's something that I used to be certified in. I'm not anymore, but it's kind of a costly process, similar to LEED, and it's, I think, a lot harder to rationalize when you're just designing landscapes, because the overall construction budget of a landscape versus an entire fancy building it makes the economy of scale of going through an entire big certification process a little bit tougher to sell. But there are a number of site certified projects in Texas, and the Parks Department has been talking about whether or not they want every park in the future to be site certified. Clark, how do I integrate human cultural heritage into our work? So I think a few things I want to say about that. We try to be very careful about not putting leaders on projects that don't have any lived experience that could connect to the cultural heritage of the places we work. So one example of that is it's a little out of what I usually do, but we did a neighborhood plan for Montrose in Houston, which is Houston's neighborhood. I'm super out butch, queer, yay, go pride kind of person, and like have been super involved in LGBTQ advocacy and all of that stuff. And so I ended up project managing that project for our company because we wanted to make sure that we were cultivating just like a really queer team. for the neighborhood of Houston, for the counterculture of Houston. And I think on the work that we just did for Great Springs Project, where we did an equity framework for them, a big part of that is really making sure that we're including the voices that aren't at the table already or haven't historically been at the table. And so we cultivated an entire equity task force that had representatives from throughout that San Antonio-Austin corridor, but that represented many different Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities throughout that corridor, including like the Indigenous Cultures Institute. And I think also just to say that especially when we're including those folks, we firmly advocate for making sure that we pay those folks a stipend. So that's another key piece. And yeah, I think it depends again, Clark, on where we're working. Does celebration or at least recognition of diverse and multifaceted cultural heritage contribute to the greater concept of resilience? Yeah, so I think the most direct way that I can respond to that is that there's so much, and of course I go back to the science, but when you have places that feel connected to the cultural heritage of community, that sense of belonging that's cultivated has direct impact on community mental health, on individual mental health. And so I think that that's really a key piece of resilience. I think, again, I speak from my personal point of view on the cultural heritage thing. I've been pushing to do, there are a bunch of cities across the US that have LGBTQ historic context statements that basically document that cultural heritage in a city of the LGBTQ community. And there are historic context statements for all different groups, not just LGBTQ groups. But I have actually been talking a lot to folks, especially in Houston, and also I'm a part of some stuff in Austin around making sure we're documenting that heritage as a key part of the way we discuss resilience in those cities. Document and also make sure that documentation informs policy and action. So hopefully that answers your question. All right, I am running out of time. I could stop and we could chat. I was going to talk about this cool project that floods. I was going to talk about this cool engagement project where we did a digital site tour of this neighborhood in Montrose, and you could click on each of these and answer questions, but also see pictures on the ground of each place. I could talk more about equity. What do y'all want?
Well, what I want is what you've already given us. This is great. Okay, right. So, very interested in these approaches, and obviously it is multifaceted and can cover all sorts of. It's holistic. To use an overused term, it's holistic in its approach, and I think that's very exciting. One of the biggest challenges is. I'm also seeing in the planning sort of thing where you were talking about just now. You mentioned and I guess it was Montrose, the engagement strategy you were using in Montrose. I see other sorts of engagement strategies. I don't know yours, so I won't jump yours into there. But so often the engagement is limited to only those that have shown up. How do you find the voices that are hidden?
Yeah, I think we show up instead. So I think the best answer to that is, and this is certainly more difficult in COVID times, and now we're starting to get out there and do outdoor events and things like that. So it's a little bit better, but I think one of our favorite activities is to show up at existing community events, because we get folks who are never gonna just take 2 hours out of their day to come to a public meeting about something that they are not intimately familiar with already. And even someone who cares a lot about it might not take 2 hours out of their day to go across town to that public meeting in that gym. So we do these things called speak outs. this is again where we're going to existing community events. So when we did a healthy parks plan also with the Trust for Public Land here in Central Texas that covered Travis, Bastrop, and Caldwell counties. Similar framing to that Pasadena project that I showed y'all. And we went to the Mexican consulate and did intercept interviews for folks who are literally waiting hours to speak to the Mexican consulate. And so really trying to make sure that we're engaging with the immigrant communities in the region. We went to, in the Pasadena project, we went to a senior dance, a back to school dental fair. In the Central Texas one, we were realizing that that's such a huge spread for that project to be all 3 counties that we were really not reaching rural folks. So we decided that we were going to start going to high school Friday night football games. And what we do is we can do intercept surveys and interviews, or one of the, we really love doing is almost like a mini workshop. So we'll set up a tent, we'll bring out maybe 2, maybe 3 little activities that are pretty quick for people to do that we can talk to while people are doing it, or they can kind of do on their own. Sometimes we'll bring out a kids activity that keep the kids busy while the parents are talking to us. But we'll basically do these like little mini workshops that, you know, someone could spend 3 minutes and 2 minutes and put a couple Post-it notes up, or someone could spend 15 minutes talking to us and really engaging in content. And that's helped a ton. And it's also amazing how much an Instagram frame or some other photo op will get people to come take a photo. It's like kind of amazing. And then also like in the digital era, you know, especially early on in COVID, you know, we saw these virtual events as something that could either be a value add for community or a drain on community. Because again, like, we're COVID, there's a lot going on, virtual meetings, all that stuff. Like, are people really going to log into another evening meeting? But in Pasadena, we ended up, for our final workshop, we found a local Tejano DJ and had him do like a 30-minute DJ set to open up our final public meeting. And he's based in Pasadena and had a big following there. And so it was much more about like community coming together and like enjoying music. And people were like, oh my God, I love that song. That reminds me of high school. And like, it was a community building opportunity that was more about regenerative relationships than it was about like, okay, give us your feedback. Before we got to dive in and do that kind of stuff. So yeah, and I mean, actually this thing, you got to go to the website to do this. This is on this thing called Social Pinpoint, and it's super cool. We've used them a ton, and we love that it's basically a 19 question survey. If someone wants to go through the whole thing, you could go walk it out on site or ride your bike. It would be a long walk. But it was kind of a way to get people out in the neighborhood who felt isolated, because you could click on a stop and see an image of that stop, see like some content about here's the history of this place, or here's what's going on here now, and then answer this question about it, or answer this question that's kind of relevant to it. So even though this was you got to still show up to do it, we got over 500 responses for this, which is a lot for an online survey for a neighborhood, not like a citywide survey. And then last thing I'll say is we also often use text-based surveys. So we'll put signs out in public places and out in parks that'll say like, you know, what do you love most about this park? And a number to text your answer to, because some people don't have computers. Some people don't really have great access to do stuff like this. So really trying to reach people at all different scales of ability to access tech and all of that. One last thing I'll say, we had an entire rec room of a senior center log in to that Pasadena public event, which just makes my heart warm. Like, I love it. All right, Andrew, you asked for flood. What does your comment mean? I don't know what it means.
Oh, that was one of the options you mentioned. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Were you talking about this?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So this is cool. This is old. This is before my time at Asakura Robinson. But what I love about it is it's built and it's functioning. So this is Gene Green Park in Houston. We did these 3 graphics along the bottom when we were designing it. Basically, here's what the daily program in this park looks like with all the different amenities that can be used. Here's like a normal flood in this park that is literally designed to hold water and help mitigate flooding in the surrounding neighborhood. And then here's what like a major event looks like. And so you can actually see the same image on the left and right on a normal day versus a day when this park is actually detaining water. And I think, especially in Houston, there's a lot more large scale flood control projects, detention projects, basins that were really, when you let engineers run that project, so often it's a detention basin. And if you're lucky, you can put a trail around the edge. This one I love because it really came at it from the other direction. It's a park that can also act as a detention basin, but for the handful of days a year it actually has to do that, isn't it better to start from the end of what can this do as a park? So that's Gene Green. Sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I had a question real quick. Well, thank you so much again for presenting on this. I grew up near Pasadena, so it's really cool to hear that like you did all this work. But in your presentation, you mentioned that resilient planning involves a mix of like community voice and scientific data. And I don't know if this is the same for you, but like since this weekend, the passage of Prop B in Austin has been on my mind. And I just was wondering if your projects in the past have incorporated homelessness camping in your planning, and if so, how do you think that will change now for future projects?
So it's really difficult, and I think that most of the time we are seen as the more radical folks in the room around like how we want to address homelessness, and I think often try to get folks to see people experiencing homelessness as neighbors and stakeholders in process, and that's really that's hard to get people to do. And I mean, we couldn't have passed Prop B in this city if we didn't think of homelessness as this abstract thing, and if we had empathy for the people experiencing it. So to get folks all the way to the point of like being able to say these are our neighbors is a stretch, but that's really our end goal, right? So I'll give you 2 examples on that Williamson Creek project that I actually skipped over. That's we're doing some vision planning that's still in draft form right now and open for some final comment for a section of Williamson Creek along some floodplain buyout areas. And this came up a lot, and there was a lot of tension with some of the folks in the neighborhood around these issues. And we ended up working with the Other Ones Foundation, which is a group that does a lot of bringing resources and programming to support folks who are experiencing homelessness. And they were a part of all of our process. And there is no silver bullet in that process for how to improve, the environment for everyone, including those folks. But one of the things that Watershed is doing that I think we were trying to model a little bit in that is they created like a triage system for what they were going to do on watershed lands if people were camping or living out on watershed lands. So if someone is living in a high hazard area, like in the middle of a floodway in a creek that flash floods, they have a certain notice period to vacate that area for their own safety. And an entire process where they're bringing services and working with some of those homeless advocacy organizations in helping people to vacate or helping to bring other supportive services. There's like one step up from that, like likely danger, but not like imminent danger. There's like a bunch of levels basically. And then there's like, you're on watershed lands, but you're not in a place that is putting you in immediate danger. And what they started doing, and I actually needed an update on this. They came to talk about it at Environmental Commission within the last couple of years. They were working with those communities, providing receptacles, and also bringing services out to them, letting them know when garbage pickup was going to happen, bringing health services and other supportive services out to them. And so they were working more with them and trying to encourage more land stewardship as a part of that. And there's actually a program that we cite, I think, in the Williamson Creek work, where they have started to actually pay people experiencing homelessness to help with cleanup and land stewardship, especially in sensitive areas. So it's evolving. I'm hopeful that, I think I just saw a headline today that said 3,000 people in the city. They're looking to target in the next 3 years housing for 3,000 people in the city experiencing homelessness. So hopefully we're moving in the right direction, and that this passage of this proposition does not mean that we just don't have to look at people, but it's still occurring everywhere.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thank you.
that's such a big issue. And I think it's important for us to think about, especially because I do think passage of the prop, I think before that, a lot of where people were hiding was in our creek beds. And there are stories, I know Greg Kassar, I think in the paper, maybe it was his social media, quoted a homeless individual who talked about some of his friends getting washed away and killed. And I'm sure that's where folks will be forced to sort of head back into more of these wilderness areas and creeks.
And I guess this is super relevant to some stuff I didn't talk about like trauma and change. And like, there is so much about resilience work and about this more holistic thinking around environmental work that it's all about change. Even if we are buying you out of your house because it has flood regularly, there's still trauma associated with being displaced from your home. Even if you're going to be in a better scenario 2 years down the line because you're moving and they bought you out, it's still traumatic. And so even positive change in the long term is traumatic change in the short term at all different scales of the work we're doing. And I think like homelessness is another thing where, there is so much that we need to talk about around mental health and also how that relates to climate justice and environmental justice that we're just not doing right now. And there's so many articles that are starting to kind of come out around mental health and climate and environmental issues. And this was my last slide and it's my favorite quote. So I wanted to get here because it directly relates to how we cope with change. But anyway, yeah. Sydney, you had a question too, I think.
Yeah, I was just wondering what you think the big differences between projects that are gentrifying neighborhoods are versus what sort of your more projects are doing better.
This is tough because in Texas, the state doesn't give us a lot of tools to protect people from displacement. They actually bar us from using tools that other places use. And I think that there's a lot of conversation out there. Sorry, my wife is calling because she thought I was done at 7:30, I think. But there's a lot of conversation out there about like, should we just do just green enough because we don't want to displace people? Because if we make it too nice and too green and that park is awesome, the value of the properties around it are going to increase so much that the people you wanted to do that for don't actually get to benefit from it. Or even in our work in New Orleans, we're doing like green infrastructure, flood mitigation, all of that kind of stuff. And it's like, if you reduce the flood risk for a neighborhood, it's no longer cheap enough to live there for a lot of the people who live there. And fundamentally, I think we need to get to a point in society where we can agree that there is a fundamental right to live in a place that does not cause you harm. I think that's kind of at the theoretical perspective. What you're asking is more practical. I think that one of the things we try to do in a place where we don't have a lot of regulatory mechanisms is we try to make sure that we're bringing these visions along with community. And that they have agency in decision making. I think all too often, I'll just give the example, like parks and trails organizations don't see like anti-displacement work as core to their work around parks and trails. And we're trying to change that. So in some of the work we're doing with Parks and Trails organizations, there are key recommendations that say you need an anti-displacement strategy and an accountability structure to those vulnerable communities that you're working with. This is kind of a burgeoning conversation, honestly, for Central Texas, because I don't really think we do have meaningful structures in place to really protect people, especially in a place like Austin, where, you know, the nicer park that you're going to get is probably really not the thing that is pushing people over the edge with our housing shortage. So I guess like then the other answer is, if you think about the larger system, if you're really an environmentalist and you care about equity and justice, then you should be fighting for a new land development code that allows for compact and connected development in the urban core, so we can stop sprawling into greenfield out on the edges, and so that we can actually have enough housing for the amount of people who live in the city.
I think part of that too is that the existing communities, the ones that are in danger of being displaced, their social structures aren't as obvious necessarily. They may be long lasting, they may be deep felt by the individuals involved, but they're not easily perceived by outsiders. So a challenge is, how do you encourage those communities to take agency with the place, to embrace the place and make it their own, not someone else's perception of what it should be. And that's a major challenge. It's an empowerment challenge, where too often we go in and dictate, well, you need this, as opposed to, well, no, we don't. We have something going on here already. Question I have real quickly here, I know you have to go, but it has to do with the idea of resiliency. And that is, we see these great projects, these wonderful projects, but by its definition, resiliency has to be adaptable into future conditions. So what do you build things into your project for your client so that there is ongoing evaluation, methods for adaptation, things like that? Okay.
And it differs based on different projects. You know, I think just going back to like the Healthy Places Toolkit, we're trying to give such a wide menu of options that is going to be automatically adaptable to all different users of that toolkit, in thinking about what makes sense most for their community. But then if you think about like site scale design, you know, that Dallas Water Gardens project, we talked a bunch with some wetland scientists at like John Bunker Sands Wetland Center, which is up near Dallas. If you've never been there, it's a really cool site. And they were like, we thought we knew how the kind of wetland plant succession was going to look and how this ecosystem was going to evolve after we constructed it. And we were surprised by pretty much everything. And these are like the experts in their field.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, I think you have to set up these systems to have enough of that monitoring and oversight, but have also, to be honest, just the right people who know how to adapt. And I guess like part of what we can do is say, you know, if this, then that in some of our kind of long-term strategies, you know, but there's only so many if this statements that we can create. So we're talking about it right now because we're doing an urban prairie resilience project in Houston at an affordable housing and transitional housing site. So it got National Fish and Wildlife Federation funding through New Hope Housing, which is the affordable housing provider on site, to restore urban prairie on this site and green infrastructure features, and potentially have some workforce development and a community garden. And, you know, the standard maintenance practices of a site like that, like they certainly don't have the knowledge base to be able to adapt to how that system is going to evolve. We can set them up with some of those tools, but another key piece is, you know, the city is working on this project as well. They're one of the key partners, and they're going to be looking at exploring funding to help support a specific staff hire to do two things. One, manage that system and manage the maintenance of it, and train other people to manage a very different system than what they're used to doing, which is like mowing medians in their parking lot. And then also do environmental education on site. And so monitoring will be a part of that. But also, being able to be that kind of connector between how that site functions. So I think like it's a tough question, Clark. It's a tough question. Plus, and I hate to say this because it sounds like I'm just trying to make sure I stay in business, but like I think we have to consistently update our planning work. So the city's climate equity plan that right now is stuck in purgatory because we don't want to piss off the Texas legislature. Seriously, that is literally why it's not going to council right now, is because the legislature has a bunch of bad climate bills. And so we're waiting until the legislature's over for it to go to council, which sucks because then we can't align funding because council hasn't directed implementation to happen. Anyway, all of that. But where was I going with this?
Well, it sounds like not at the risk of oversimplification, that one of the biggest challenges is developing an ongoing generational culture of involvement, and it's not just the project, but it's also the community you leave behind when the project is delivered. Okay.
Yeah, I just remembered what I was going to say though too. Like I think institutionalizing constant adaptation of visions is important, and I think like that climate equity plan is on a 5-year update cycle. So like so basically you do the plan for a year, you talk about implementation for 2 years, then you start talking about redoing the plan, and then you're at the 5-year mark. But that, I mean, that is the way that we're gonna chip away. But I think you're also right. Like I think the way that we engage in community and feel ownership and responsibility is so important. And I always go back to, I think this might have come up in some of our work with an Indigenous Cultures Institute, or especially around Indigenous lands, just this idea that, Americans, especially white Americans, are born and have entitlements, and, much more related to Indigenous cultures, this idea that you're born and you have responsibilities. And that is probably the thing that I get most despondent over, is the fact that I think that there are so many folks in our community that do not feel any responsibility to their community, that there's such an individualism in the US that it feels daunting to overcome.
I agree completely. Katie, I know your wife's saying you got to go.
Oh, no, she wasn't. She just thought I was done at 7:30. I just told her I was done at 8, and I got distracted because I know she's on her way home from tennis. She subbed in for me at tennis, and anyway, yeah.
Never mind. Well, I really want to thank you for being with us tonight. It is always a pleasure to talk to you and hear the fine work that you're doing. So thank you very much.
Happy to, and happy to follow up if folks have more questions or comments.
Definitely. And I know I owe you a social visit at some point soon. And I always love talking to you too, Katie, because I feel like we're in such different spheres, in the nonprofit and private sectors, and yet a lot of what we're thinking about overlaps. And I always learn a lot from you. And so when we get together soon, I'll tell you some of what SBCA is working on in our trails work. And you jogged some things in my memory about functional green, because I'm thinking about how can we implement some of that perhaps ahead of a land development code. So there's a lot of things that we can follow up on. But anyway, really appreciate it.
Thanks. I appreciate it, and hope everyone has a good night.
Oh, before we leave, Katie, are you okay with us sharing this recording?
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks.
Thanks, Katie.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you so
Bye.
much.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.